Welcome to Mr. Horror. Today, we're sharing some of the most bone-chilling true home intruder horror stories you'll ever hear. Are you ready to be scared out of your mind? Let's get started. It was a dark and stormy night, and Maria was alone in her small house on the edge of town. She had just settled into bed when she heard a sound coming from downstairs. At first, she thought it was just the wind rattling the windows, but then she heard it again, a soft but unmistakable thump. Maria sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, listening for any more sounds, but the only thing she could hear was the sound of the rain tapping against the roof. Maria tried to calm herself down, telling herself that it was just her imagination. She had always been a bit of a scaredy cat, and she knew that she had a tendency to get spooked by the smallest things. But just as she was starting to relax, she heard the sound again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Maria swallowed hard, her mind racing. She knew that something was wrong, that someone was in her house. She tried to convince herself that it was just a random noise, but deep down, she knew that she was in danger. She looked around her room, searching for anything that she could use as a weapon. But there was nothing, just her phone, which she had left charging on the nightstand. She knew that she needed to call for help, but she didn't want to alert the intruder to her presence. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Her heart pounding in her chest, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Hello, what's your emergency?" The voice on the other end of the line was calm and reassuring. "There's someone in my house," Maria whispered, trying to keep her voice as low as possible. "Please, you have to send someone." The operator told her to stay on the line and stay as quiet as possible. Maria could hear the intruder moving around downstairs, opening and closing drawers. She held her breath, waiting for the police to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, Maria realized that the police weren't going to make it in time. She heard the sound of the intruder's footsteps getting closer and closer until she could hear him breathing just outside her door. And then the door creaked open. Maria's heart was racing as she watched the door slowly swing open. The intruder stepped into the room, his face hidden behind a mask. Maria tried to back away, but she was trapped in the corner of the room. The intruder stepped towards her, his hand outstretched. Maria screamed and lashed out, kicking him in the stomach. The intruder stumbled backwards, and Maria used the opportunity to run towards the door. But just as she reached the door, the intruder grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back towards him. Maria struggled to break free, but the intruder was too strong. He pinned her to the ground, his hand still wrapped tightly around her arm. Maria thrashed and kicked, but it was no use. The intruder was too powerful. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt me." But the intruder just laughed, a cold and humorless sound. Maria realized that he was enjoying this, that he was taking pleasure in her fear. And then, suddenly, the door burst open. Maria looked up to see two police officers standing in the doorway, their guns drawn. The intruder immediately released her and ran towards the window. Maria watched as he leaped out, disappearing into the night. The police searched the house, but they couldn't find any trace of the intruder. Maria was shaken and traumatized, but she was relieved to be alive. Over the next few weeks, Maria tried to put the incident behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being in danger. She started sleeping with a knife under her pillow, and she was constantly looking over her shoulder. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a knock at the door. She froze, her heart racing. She asked who it was, but there was no answer. The knocking continued, louder and more insistent. Maria could feel her palms getting sweaty, her stomach churning with fear. Finally, she mustered up the courage to open the door, but when she did, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on the doorstep. Maria picked it up and opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, there was just a single sheet of paper with two words written in block letters: "I'm back." Maria's hands shook as she read the words on the piece of paper. She knew immediately who it was from, the intruder who had broken into her home. She tried to keep calm, telling herself that it was just a sick prank, but as the days went by, the notes kept coming. They were always short and to the point, but they were enough to make Maria feel like she was being watched, like someone was always lurking just out of sight. She started sleeping with the lights on, and she stopped going out after dark. She knew that she was letting her fear control her, but she couldn't help it. She felt like she was being stalked by a ghost. One night, as she was lying in bed, Maria heard the sound of footsteps outside her window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper that sent chills down her spine. "I told you I was back," the voice said. Maria tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voice was gone. The footsteps receded, and Maria was left alone in the silence of her room. The next morning, Maria contacted the police. They searched her house and the surrounding area, but they couldn't find any trace of the intruder. Maria knew that she couldn't live like this anymore. She packed her bags and left town, moving to a new city where no one knew her name. But even as she tried to start over, Maria knew that she would never be able to forget the terror that had haunted her for so long. She knew that the intruder was still out there, somewhere, waiting for his next victim. The years went by, and Maria tried to put the past behind her. She got married and started a family, and she did her best to live a normal life. But every time she heard a strange noise in the night or caught a glimpse of a shadow moving outside her window, she couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. Because even though she had left that town behind, and even though she had left the intruder behind, Maria knew that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting for his chance to strike again. And she knew that she would never be truly safe, not as long as he was still out there, lurking in the shadows. It was a quiet evening in the suburban neighborhood. The sun had set, and the street was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Natalie was home alone, her husband out of town on business. She was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when she heard a noise at the back door. She turned down the volume and listened, her heart pounding in her chest. There it was again, a faint scraping sound, like someone was trying to pry the door open. Natalie tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a stray animal or a neighbor coming to borrow something. But as the sound grew louder and more insistent, she knew that it was something far more sinister. She crept towards the back door, peering through the window to see if she could spot anything outside, but it was too dark and she couldn't see anything beyond her own reflection. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Natalie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She listened intently, waiting for the sound to start up again. And then, just as she was about to turn away, there was a loud bang. The door flew open and a figure stepped into the room. Natalie screamed and backed away, her heart racing. The intruder stepped towards her, his face hidden behind a mask. Natalie tried to run, but the intruder was too fast. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back towards him. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt me." But the intruder just laughed, a cold and humorless sound. He pushed her to the ground, pinning her there with his weight. Natalie tried to fight back, but it was no use. The intruder was too strong. She could feel his hot breath on her face, smell the stench of his unwashed body. She knew that she was in grave danger, but as the intruder leaned in closer, his hand reaching for her throat, Natalie saw her chance. With all her strength, she kicked out at the intruder's knee, hearing the satisfying crack of bone as he stumbled backwards. She scrambled to her feet, running towards the door, but just as she reached it, the intruder caught her by the ankle, pulling her back towards him. Natalie screamed, lashing out with her other foot. She felt the satisfying thud of her heel connecting with the intruder's face, and he stumbled backwards, releasing her ankle. Natalie ran out of the room, grabbing her phone and dialing 911 as she fled. She could hear the intruder cursing and screaming behind her, but she didn't stop until she was safely outside, the police on their way. It was weeks before Natalie felt safe again. But even as she tried to move on from the traumatic incident, she couldn't shake the feeling that the intruder was still out there, somewhere, waiting to strike again. After the attack, Natalie felt like she was living in a constant state of fear. She had trouble sleeping, jumping at every noise and constantly checking the locks on her doors and windows. She worked with the police to try and identify the intruder, but he had left no trace behind. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no clues at all. Natalie started to feel like she was going crazy. She became paranoid, convinced that the intruder was watching her every move. She started seeing shadows in the corners of her eyes and hearing faint footsteps outside her window. One night, Natalie woke up to find the intruder standing at the foot of her bed. She screamed and lashed out, but he was too fast. He pinned her down, his hands wrapped tightly around her throat. Natalie struggled, fighting for every breath. She clawed at the intruder's face, trying to break his grip. But it was no use, he was too strong. Just as she thought she was going to pass out, Natalie remembered something she had read online, a trick for escaping an attacker who was choking you. With all her strength, Natalie reached up and grabbed the intruder's ear. She twisted it as hard as she could, feeling the cartilage give way beneath her fingers. The intruder screamed and released her, stumbling backwards. Natalie took her chance, running towards the door and out into the night. She called the police again, and they arrived quickly. This time, they were able to catch the intruder. He had left a fingerprint on the window he had climbed through. As it turned out, the intruder was a serial rapist who had been targeting women in the area for months. Natalie's attack had been one of the more violent ones he had committed, but thanks to her bravery, he was finally brought to justice. Natalie started seeing a therapist, trying to work through the trauma of what had happened to her. It was a long and difficult process, but with time, she started to feel like herself again. But even as she moved on from the attack, Natalie knew that she would never be able to forget the fear and helplessness she had felt. and she knew that she would always be looking over her shoulder, waiting for the intruder to come back and finish what he had started. Years went by, and Natalie started to rebuild her life. She moved to a new city, got married, and had children of her own. But even as she tried to put the past behind her, the fear of the intruder lingered. One night, when Natalie was home alone with her children, she heard a faint tapping at the window. Her heart racing, she crept towards the window, trying to see who was outside. And then, to her horror, she saw him, the intruder, standing on her front lawn, staring up at her with cold, dead eyes. Natalie felt like she was back in that room, pinned down and helpless, but this time, she was not alone. She had her children to protect, and she was not going to let the intruder win. With a sense of determination, Natalie called the police and then locked all the doors and windows. She gathered her children close, telling them that everything was going to be okay. The intruder tried to break in, banging on the door and throwing rocks at the windows. But Natalie stood strong, refusing to give in to fear. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the intruder was gone. The police arrived a few minutes later, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Natalie never saw the intruder again, but she knew that he was still out there somewhere. And she knew that she would never be able to fully escape the fear that he had instilled in her. But in that moment, with her children safe and the police on their way, Natalie felt like she had won a small victory. She had stood up to her attacker, and she had come out on top. It was a long and difficult road to recovery, but Natalie knew that she was stronger now because of what she had been through. And she hoped that by sharing her story, she could help others who had experienced similar trauma. As she tucked her children into bed that night, Natalie knew that the fear would always be a part of her life. But she also knew that she was not alone, and that together they could face anything that came their way. The quiet of the night was interrupted by the sound of shattering glass. Jake was jolted awake, his heart racing as he tried to process what was happening. Had someone broken into his house? He listened carefully, straining to hear any movement outside his bedroom door. But all he could hear was the sound of his own panicked breathing. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming closer and closer. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to defend himself. He reached for his phone, ready to dial 911, but then he remembered his phone was downstairs. There was no way he could make it to the phone without being caught. He had to think of something else. As the footsteps grew louder, Jake's mind went blank. He had no idea what to do. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized that he was completely helpless. And then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Jake heard a faint rustling sound, like someone was going through his things. He knew that he had to act fast. With a burst of adrenaline, Jake leapt out of bed and charged towards the door. He flung it open, ready to face whoever was on the other side. But to his surprise, there was no one there. The house was silent, the only sound the faint whirring of the ceiling fan. Jake was confused. Had he imagined the whole thing? But as he looked around, he saw that his living room window had been smashed and the shards of glass lay scattered across the floor. It was then that the realization hit him. Someone had broken into his house and they had gotten away. Jake's heart sank as he thought about what could have happened if he had been caught. He knew that he had to take steps to ensure that it never happened again. From that day on, Jake installed a security system and double-checked all of his locks every night. But even with all of the precautions, he could never shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone was waiting for him to let his guard down. And so, Jake lived in a constant state of fear, always looking over his shoulder and waiting for the next intrusion. Jake's fear consumed him, to the point where he became paranoid. He spent every night awake, listening for any sound that might signal an intruder. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Jake became increasingly isolated, afraid to leave his home for fear that someone might break in while he was gone. His friends and family tried to convince him that he was safe, that the intruder was likely long gone. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the intruder was still out there somewhere. The fear had taken hold of him, and he felt like he was drowning in it. He began to lose weight, and his once athletic frame became gaunt and frail. One night, as Jake was lying in bed, he heard a faint tapping at his bedroom window. His heart racing, he crept towards the window, trying to see who was outside. But there was no one there, just an empty street and the faint glow of the streetlights. Jake was confused. Had he imagined it? And then he heard it again, louder this time. He realized that the tapping was coming from inside the house. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to defend himself. He had no weapons, no means of protecting himself if the intruder broke in. With shaking hands, Jake dialed 911, his voice barely above a whisper as he reported the break-in. The operator assured him that help was on the way, but Jake knew that he couldn't wait for the police to arrive. He retreated to his bedroom, locking the door behind him. He could hear the intruder moving around in the living room, knocking over furniture and rifling through drawers. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to think of a way out. He knew that he had to act fast before the intruder found him. And then, to his relief, he heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because suddenly the house was silent. Jake stayed locked in his bedroom until the police arrived, his body shaking with fear. But when they searched the house, they found no sign of the intruder. Jake was relieved that he had made it out alive, but he knew that the fear would never leave him. He had become a prisoner in his own home, always looking over his shoulder and waiting for the next intrusion. The thought of the intruder was always in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the fragility of his safety. And even though the police assured him that they were doing everything they could to catch the intruder, Jake knew that he could never feel truly safe again. After the break-in, Jake's life was never the same. He had trouble sleeping, and every creak and noise in his house sent him into a panic. He began to see a therapist who helped him work through his trauma and anxiety. Slowly but surely, Jake began to feel like himself again. He also took steps to make his home more secure. He installed a security system, bought a guard dog, and made sure that all of his doors and windows were locked at night. But even with these measures in place, Jake still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He never felt completely safe, and he knew that he probably never would. Months turned into years, and Jake continued to live in fear, but he never gave up hope that the intruder would be caught and brought to justice. Then, one day, he received a call from the police. They had finally apprehended a suspect in a string of home invasions, including the one at Jake's house. Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. The man who had caused him so much fear and anxiety was finally behind bars. Over time, Jake began to feel like he could move on from the trauma of the break-in. He even started to volunteer at a local shelter, helping victims of domestic violence and home invasion. But the memory of that night would always be with him, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of being vigilant. As he locked up his house at night, Jake knew that he couldn't completely let his guard down. But he also knew that he was stronger than he had ever been before and that he could face whatever came his way. Thanks for watching this scary True Home Intruder Horror Stories video. If you enjoyed the stories, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more terrifying content like this. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Stay safe and be sure to keep your doors locked tonight.